Did you know that Utah women voted for the first time almost 150 years ago? The 19th Amendment gave voting rights to women across America, and even then, not all women were allowed to vote, like Native American women and Asian immigrants and other women of color. But many women in western states had been voting long before 1920. Many people know that Wyoming, the equality state, was the leading territory and state in granting women suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote. But what many people don't know is that Utah was also a leader in the women's suffrage movement. Women in Utah were the first to cast ballots in the modern United States, doing so on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1870, just 2 days after the Utah Territory granted women suffrage. And Seraph, a school teacher, was the very first woman to cast a vote. Women in Utah were exercising their newly granted rights and voting, but there were a bunch of people who were not happy with the way these women were voting. You see, the Mormons practiced polygamy, which is when a man can be married to more than one woman. And there were many people who thought polygamy was awful, that it enslaved and oppressed women. So they had hoped that by giving Utah women voting rights, that these women would vote to end polygamy. But when that didn't happen, these anti-polygamists started lobbying the United States Congress to take away Utah women's right to vote. Eventually, it did. In 1887, after women in Utah had been voting for 17 years, the U.S. Congress passed the Edmonds Tucker Act that tried to end polygamy in many ways. One of these ways was taking away all Utah women's voting rights, Mormon or non-Mormon, married or single. These women were upset. They spent almost a decade fighting to get their voting rights back. They wrote petitions, lobbied Congress, held protests, organized suffrage organizations, and worked with national suffragists like Susan B. Anthony. After the LDS Church officially stopped practicing polygamy, the U.S. Congress invited Utah to apply for statehood once again. And in 1895, after a lot of lobbying by Utah and national suffragists, equal suffrage for both men and women citizens was written into the Utah State Constitution, once again granting women's voting rights, and this time also allowing women to run for and hold public office. But Utah women didn't stop there. They continued to work towards and demand a national suffrage amendment, still partnering with national suffrage organizations and leaders. And after a long, hard fight, the 19th Amendment granting women's suffrage was ratified in August 1920. In 2020, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of this amendment and the 150th anniversary of Seraph Young's historic vote in Salt Lake City, both important steps toward including women's voices in the political process.